President himself has said in the last 6 weeks or so.
The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
Do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam, with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan.
And yet that is precisely what we have seen over these last few days. How do you explain getting this so wrong?
Well, first, Savanah, to be fair, the helicopter has been the mode of transport from our embassy to the airport for the last 20 years.
But you know the larger point. It's not the helicopter. It's not the mechanism. No, it's the last-minute scramble. You know that. It's the last-minute scramble when the assurances from the president himself were this was not what we were going to see.
It is certainly the case.
And yeah, that was a really bad answer, saying, oh, well, we always use helicopters, which doesn't really get to the real question. If I were to have any criticism of Savanah Guthrie, the way she followed up, by the time Savanah Guthrie was asking that question, we had already seen pictures of people in Afghanistan clinging to the sides of airplanes, and there are even reports people fell off. So. Who was the person who said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes? And so it's not people falling off helicopters, but people falling off airplanes at the airport is pretty much history rhyming in my point of view. And I think Savanah Guthrie could have driven that point home by mentioning that. But otherwise, I thought she did a pretty good job of responding somewhat incredulously to Jake Sullivan's answer there. But I did say earlier that I delayed the beginning of the show so I could show you a few clips of Joe Biden's address to the nation, and I specifically wanted to show what he did to try to make up for what you saw there from Jake Sullivan, and also later I'm going to show you a couple lengthy clips from Secretary of State Antony Blinken trying to respond to the Biden administration's responsibility for not who lost Afghanistan, but who is, the Biden administration is responsible for this poorly planned, poorly executed withdrawal, whatever you want to say. What's been going on over the weekend specifically contradicts things that Joe Biden said, just like you saw Savanah Guthrie ask Jake Sullivan in that last clip. And so, to his credit, at least to a minimal extent, Joe Biden in his speech earlier today did take responsibility and did, speak honestly how there's at least one sentence in this first clip where he takes responsibility for not anticipating the speed that Afghanistan has fallen, although then he immediately segues into blaming the Afghan people and Afghan leaders, and specifically Ashraf Ghani, and I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that clip from earlier, about an hour or so ago, that I recorded from Fox News over here.
We plan for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force of some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force.
They do now. they do now. I almost use that as my political comedy clip because that is actually what I said when I was watching that speech live, when he said the Taliban doesn't have an air force. Well, they do now. They actually captured a lot of American equipment, and so that was a little bit tone deaf, even though at the beginning he did take, talking straight to the American people, took some responsibility for being surprised by how swiftly the Afghan people or the Afghan government collapsed. And there are a lot of reasons for that I'll talk about, but I did want to show one more clip of Biden actually making the ultimate statement of presidential responsibility. I see my live viewers are saying that the beginning of the show got cut off. That happened a few weeks ago, and then I had to upload the recorded version. I'll see if the archive of the live stream has the beginning cut off, and if it does, then I will have to upload the recorded version and do a premiere video in a few hours, and we'll all watch it together like I did a few weeks ago. But anyway, I want to move on to this shorter clip of near the end of the speech of Biden at least taking the ultimate statement of presidential responsibility over here.
Our mission in Afghanistan has taken many missteps, made many missteps over the past 2 decades. I'm now the 4th American president to preside over war in Afghanistan, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th president. I will not mislead the American people by claiming that just a little more time in Afghanistan will make all the difference. Nor will I shrink from my share of responsibility for where we are today and how we must move forward from here. I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me.
And see, he paused there for the cameras, because that's the presidential responsibility moment, and going to the "Who Lost China" thing. Wasn't it Harry Truman who had that sign on his desk in the Oval Office? The buck stops here. So ever since Truman, who I guess lost China, now Biden has to lose Afghanistan. But the thing is, Biden has had a long history of opposing the continued involvement of the United States in Afghanistan. And, I mentioned this video I made back in February 2009, which is when, in the, second month of the Obama administration, President Obama decided to surge troops into Afghanistan. And you'll see in his speech today, that is something that Biden referenced that he opposed. He didn't mention that he opposed. He says 2009. He doesn't mention it was President Obama. But this is really important, and the reason I'm going to show this clip and then the video I made in February 2009 is all the rest of the clips from the Sunday shows. They're really kind of a fight between, is this Biden's fault or is it Trump's fault? And they don't really look at how it's actually George W. Bush's fault and Barack Obama's fault. And they also have lots of blame for who lost Afghanistan. But before I get to my video, Who Lost Afghanistan from 2009, here is Joe Biden kind of making that point. This is actually in between the last 2 clips I showed, but I put it here for my narrative purposes, and I'll talk about it with you a little more after we watch together over here.
We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11th, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. That's why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. And that's why, as president, I'm adamant that we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan.
And so he's saying that it doesn't even make sense to have the troops in Afghanistan because it's not special in terms of being a terrorist threat for Al-Qaeda. But you did notice how he talked about February 2009, and that's why, or he talked about 2009, the surge that he opposed. And I actually made this video in February 2009. I have to import it here. Hopefully I can do that without messing anything up. Let's see. Hold on a second here.
LiberalViewer present.
So President Barack Obama's announcement last week that he'd fulfill his campaign pledge to send more American troops to Afghanistan caused some strange reactions, perhaps strangest of all on Fox News, where, despite Democrats...
Sorry, I didn't mean to start that. I'm going to start it again in just a minute, but I had to change the properties a little bit when I imported it there. But anyway, the point that I'm making is that in February 2009, as you're going to see in this video, I talk about two mistakes, or two presidents who made lots of mistakes, George W. Bush and then Barack Obama. Even here, I am very skeptical about the surge, just like Joe Biden was back in February 2009. But I also mention the shift of resources away from Afghanistan to go to Iraq. Do you remember how they let Osama bin Laden get away in Tora Bora because all these troops were in Iraq and not Afghanistan? That is kind of the background in this video. And then the main topic here is just how there's all this corruption that this is something that the U.S. military, they always pick like the strongest warlords to stop the Taliban, but never really made sure they had loyalty to the central government or any grassroots support amongst the people, or even respect for the rights of any of the people that they were governing. So anyway, I wanted to give that background before showing. This is 6.5 minutes video I made in February 2009, but I think it's important to look at the first two presidents before I show all the clips from yesterday talking about the mistakes of the last two presidents to handle Afghanistan. So here it is, an old-style LiberalViewer video we can watch together over here.
LiberalViewer present.
So President Barack Obama's announcement last week that he'd fulfill his campaign pledge to send more American troops to Afghanistan caused some strange reactions, perhaps strangest of all on Fox News, where, despite Democrats having argued for years that troop levels in Iraq have taken attention away from al-Qaeda's actual pace in Afghanistan, Fox News contributor Michelle Malkin somehow managed to find a Democrat double standard in continuing to approach Iraq and Afghanistan differently, as you can see here.
I think that this is as stark an example of Democrat double standards that you're going to get. And it's great to remind people of recent history and what happened in the prelude up to the Iraq war surge. You had people like, Joe Biden grandstanding on the Senate floor and passing resolutions as part of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in heated opposition to any kind of surge tactics. And he pounded his fists and said that this was the absolute wrong way to go. You had thousands of people taking to the streets, Answer, Code Pink, accusing the Bush administration of sending our troops into their deaths and murder. And now here essentially you have the continuation of surge policies and not a peep from these anti-war people.
Of course, saying there's not a peep from any anti-war people is not exactly accurate, given that there's still an anti-war left, and, as exemplified by progressive Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters' exchange with HBO's Bill Maher last Friday, they still show the concern with troop increases that you can see here.
Obama sending 17,000 troops to Afghanistan, is it really going to make a difference? Are we really going to pull that one out? They play soccer with human heads. I don't know if they're, it's bad to say they're not ready for freedom or that, but you know what? Maybe they're not. Maybe they're not ready.
Well, the Progressive Caucus will be putting out something very soon to try and engage the president about sending the troops to Afghanistan. We don't want to substitute Afghanistan for Iraq.
But it's not a question of substituting Afghanistan for Iraq. It's removing Iraq as a distraction from fixing our failure to give the people of Afghanistan a working government after decades of fighting our wars for us. And you can't separate this failure in Afghanistan from our preoccupation with Iraq and George W. Bush's surge policy there, as Barack Obama explained himself in his debate with John McCain last September in this clip.
We cannot separate Afghanistan from Iraq because what our commanders have said is we don't have the troops right now to deal with Afghanistan. So I would send 2 to 3 additional brigades to Afghanistan. Now keep in mind that we have 4 times the number of troops in Iraq, where nobody had anything to do with 9/11 before we went in, where in fact there was no Al-Qaeda before we went in. But we have 4 times more troops there than we do in Afghanistan. And that is a strategic mistake because every intelligence agency will acknowledge that Al-Qaeda is the greatest threat against the United States, and that Secretary of Defense Gates acknowledged the Central Front, that the place where we have to deal with these folks is going to be in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So here's what we have to do comprehensively, though. It's not just more troops. We have to press the Afghan government to make certain that they are actually working for their people.
And making sure the government of Afghanistan is working for its people is even more important than the increase in troop levels, because that's where the United States has failed Afghanistan, rather than Afghanistan just not being ready for freedom, as Bill Maher claimed in that previous clip. That's because just having elections in Afghanistan doesn't shift all the blame for the country's failures to the Afghan people, particularly when the U.S. military often short-circuited that democracy and installed thieving thug warlords not accountable to the people, as journalist-turned-humanitarian activist Sarah Chase explained in a radio interview on NPR this month here.
First of all, we were the ones who basically brought President Karzai to the fore. So when he was elected, it was 2 years after he had already been in power. But part of why he was popular is because we were backing him, and the Afghans trusted us to bring them a properly functioning, responsive state, right? And then what they say, and this is what's really accurate, is we actually imposed a lot of these warlord governors who have become the problem. And I watched this happen in Kandahar, where President Karzai actually appointed somebody else to be governor of Kandahar, and we brought a different person in and imposed him, and we imposed him by force of arms. And I saw us doing this time and time again. We were using these warlords as our proxies in the fight against Al-Qaeda, and we put them in positions of political power, and then we never, ever paid any attention to how they treated their population, to the point where I saw the guy that we imposed as governor of Kandahar, he had his own private militia. And that private militia was wearing U.S. Army fatigues, and they were abusing the population from the get-go. They were stealing stuff from people, they were kidnapping people, they were beating people up, they were doing whatever they wanted, and we never discipline them in any way. And so the Afghans' answer to your point is, you know what? These are your dogs. You brought them here. It's up to you to bring them to heel. And once you bring them to heel a little bit so that they're not such a danger to us, then we, the Afghan population, can reassert our own control. But right now, the deck is too heavily stacked against us for us to be able to retake control of this situation.
Now, that assessment sounds almost hopeful, as if given enough security and a more accountable government, Afghanistan could actually end up as a functioning democracy, but I'm not so sure, so I want to know what you think. What, if anything, can the Obama administration do to clean up the mess in Afghanistan left by the failed foreign policy of George W. Bush? And as a way to understand why some in Afghanistan are actually turning to the Taliban, if you were given the same choice that U.S. forces gave many of the Afghan people, who would you choose to follow? Conservative clerics or thieving thugs?
I YouTube, you decide.
So there's the old-style LiberalViewer video that I think the clips in there and the analysis in there support what I said before I showed the video, that the first 2 presidents have a lot of blame, especially George W. Bush for diverting resources to Iraq from Afghanistan so that they lost Osama bin Laden. I mean, that would have been a perfect time for U.S. forces to start drawing down if they had gotten Osama bin Laden at Tora Bora, and then they switched to this whole nation-building thing, but supported a corrupt government with thieving thug warlords like you saw at the end there. And who are you going to support? The conservative clerics of the Taliban, or the thieving thugs who are just like stealing from the people and not respecting their humanity. So it's a difficult choice. That's why there's so many people who are now trying to get out through the airport in Afghanistan. That was one of the things Joe Biden said in his speech that I didn't take a clip on, that that's the breaking news, that they're sending in 6,000 more troops, and they're going to secure the airport for the military and commercial flights to get out all the allies and the people, the American citizens, the allied forces and citizens, and then the people of Afghanistan who helped. Apparently, there are like 80, 90, 100,000 people who helped the Americans who are slated to get out of the country who still haven't gotten out, and that's why there's such a mob at the airport. But anyway, I've rambled on long enough, and I should really be transitioning to the Sunday show clips. I'm going to show you all 5 of the big 5 corporate outlet news summaries from longest to shortest, and as usual, Chuck Todd has the longest best summary along with the longest best package, right? That's what they call the pre-recorded part. There's actually a long introduction. As I said, my main criticism of all these news summaries and all the newsmaker clips I'm going to show you afterwards is that they have like the short-term memory to make it a fight between is Biden to blame or Trump to blame, but they don't really go back and talk about George W. Bush and Barack Obama's blame. That surge of troops and Obama's promise that it was going to give space to create a government responsive to the people. Well, that didn't work. So I also blame Barack Obama. I blame George W. Bush. I blame Trump for the bad deal he made with the Taliban, and I'll be talking about that, especially when I show the Mike Pompeo clip on Fox News Sunday. And then Biden did not have this evacuation plan very well. And anyway, I'll get to all that, but let's get to the first of the news summaries. Like I said, I've been talking long enough in transition. Here's NBC News Meet the Press from yesterday morning. There has been some, Kabul has basically fallen. This was when Kabul was still falling. Basically, the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan. That's the one update to the news summary, and I'll talk about the rest of the news summary a little more after we watch together over here.
Sunday morning. The scale of the developing disaster in Afghanistan has exceeded even the most pessimistic of predictions. Taliban forces seized control of the city of Jalalabad without a fight overnight. They've now entered the capital city of Kabul. They're negotiating with the government to take over the city without bloodshed. They're looking, though, for unconditional surrender. President Biden yesterday increased the number of troops he's sending to Kabul right now to help evacuate Americans and our allies, and the U.S. Embassy evacuation has now begun in full. In just the past week, the Taliban have overrun government forces, seizing control of roughly 24 provincial capitals, often without a fight, as the Afghan army simply melts away. The peril for President Biden is clear. He runs the risk of repeating the very Saigon in 1975 image he had hoped to avoid. In a statement yesterday, though, Mr. Biden said the troop withdrawal deal that President Trump struck last year was what tied his hands. Quote, it left the Taliban in the strongest position militarily since 2001 and imposed a May 1, 2021 deadline on U.S. forces. That said, the collapse we're witnessing is happening on President Biden's watch, and the blame will inevitably fall to him if the fallout is as bad as some fear. Yes, Americans in both parties supported an end to this 20-year forever war, but they also want security, and no one likes to see America humiliated. And the collapse of Afghanistan into the hands of the Taliban is likely to haunt Mr. Biden's legacy, especially if the country once again becomes a base for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, and there are renewed attacks on the U.S. and the West. The The Taliban are sweeping across Afghanistan, taking control of at least 30 of its 34 provinces over the last 10 days and their provincial capitals, including Afghanistan's second and third largest cities. Now they're in Kabul. Just last month, President Biden promised
there's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy.
But now, President Biden has ordered troops back in Afghanistan, raising the total to 5,000 to secure the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy, which has now begun. The embassy staff have been instructed to shred sensitive documents and destroy computers. The airport is now the only safe way in or out of Afghanistan.
That's one of the reasons why we move these forces, or we're moving these forces into Kabul to assist with this particular mission, because we know that time is a precious commodity here.
Just 1,200 Afghans who work for the United States as interpreters or in other jobs have been evacuated to the United States. Roughly 88,000, including family members, could need to be evacuated, according to a nonprofit advocacy group.
We have a sacred moral obligation to help those who have helped us, and we're not walking away from that.
And the United Nations is warning of a larger humanitarian disaster.
If they arrest us, they will kill us. Everyone, they will kill us.
Given the situation right now, how do you see the future for women in Afghanistan?
Taliban are not afraid of the world superpowers. They're not afraid of the B-56 or B-52. They're afraid of the women.
The top U.S. general in Afghanistan warned last month that a Taliban takeover could allow al-Qaeda to rebuild.
If that pressure comes off, I believe they're going to regenerate, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see them assert themselves and begin to plan attacks against our homeland.
Now, as President Biden stands by his withdrawal strategy,
But we're going to continue to keep our commitment, but I do not regret my decision.
he's likely to own Afghanistan's collapse.
He owns this now completely. It isn't Donald Trump's Afghan policy, it's Joe Biden's.
It's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy that was entirely preventable.
Up until now, most Americans have supported the military withdrawal, which was initially announced last year by then-President Donald Trump. But some who served in America's longest war are asking what their sacrifices were for.
I lost friends there. It's hard to understand what it was for. If this is how it ends, how do you tell veterans that it was worth it?
Why did we spend the past decade there? What was the purpose? What was the goal?
And joining me now from Kabul, a place he's been many, many times, is my colleague Richard Engel.
And Richard Engel's had a lot of great reports. I'm not going to show any of that clip, but there's a link down in the video description to the Meet the Press. Right? There's a link down in the video description to the source of all my clips, actually. But I thought that was a pretty good news summary. I mean, as I said before, they even had Ambassador Crocker on there, who was in the Obama administration. Didn't really talk about the failures of the Obama administration. I think, like I said, I think the earlier failures did not get enough coverage in any of these clips I'm going to show you. Especially the final newsmaker clip, the Liz Cheney interview by Jon Karl on ABC. I'm going to do that thing I've done a couple times before, where I play the clip and stop it and then talk and then keep playing from where I left off, where like he gets so close to like asking someone whose last name is Cheney and is like an endless war neocon about the mistakes of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, but never does. But I'll get to that clip, and I'm going to get to the next news summary in just a second, but I did want to thank my Super Chat contributors so far, especially because I think there is like a missing part of this video in the live stream, so I'm going to keep this live stream unlisted, and then I will upload the recorded version of the show with that missing part probably in a couple hours, and I'll do it as a premiere video so I can watch it live with people again. And that means that all these live comments people are leaving are going to get lost. The Super Chat contributions won't be shown, so I did want to show in the video the Super Chat contributions I got so far, if I can import this. Thank you, Lulu Girl, Tom Trask, and Matthew. Lulu Girl, the painting in the background, that was a picture of Sarah Chase that I took off of the NPR website that had the interview that I was playing the audio from. Since it was just an audio clip, I didn't have video to go with it, so that was actually a picture of Sarah Chase, I think somewhere in Afghanistan, that was on the NPR website, to answer your question. But anyway, thank you, for those Super Chat contributions. Like I said, I'm probably going to have to upload this later, and so all the live comments are going to disappear unless you want to show up again for the premiere of that video and watch it with me, and then there'll be a whole new set of live comments. But anyway, the next news summary is CBS News Face the Nation. It's the second longest one, and Nancy Cordes was in for Margaret Brennan, who's still on maternity leave. They talk about Afghanistan very briefly. They had more coverage later in the show, but I've often said CBS could be called the COVID broadcasting system because they have always had the longest, best, and most in-depth coverage of the COVID pandemic. They even covered it back in like January, February of 2020 when I said, either they are over-focusing on, they're exaggerating this story, or they are the only network that is covering what's going to be the biggest story of the year, and turned out to be number 2. See, I kind of whispered like Biden there, but yeah, it turned out to be number 2. And they spend the beginning of their program focusing on COVID, and I don't know, looking back and I have a history degree from an Ivy League university, and so I often wonder when I look at this journalism here, supposedly the first draft of history, when they look back 100 years from now, is the COVID story going to be what was the biggest story? Is the Afghanistan story going to be the biggest story? Or maybe it's going to be the climate change thing that was covered briefly. I talked about it last week. I'm not really going to talk about it this week, but maybe that'll be what was the biggest story that got not enough coverage, but who knows. Anyway, here's the CBS News Face the Nation news summary from Nancy Cordes and Mark Strassman from Atlanta, as usual, over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. We have a lot to get to this morning, including a fluid situation in Afghanistan that seems to be deteriorating by the minute. More on that soon. But we want to begin with the dire COVID-19 pandemic here in the United States. Nationwide, 77% of ICU beds are now filled. Hospitals in 5 states are at about 90% capacity. Senior national correspondent Mark Strassman begins our coverage in Atlanta.
This is a 40-year-old patient. He is a dad of an 11-year-old daughter.
Desperate times, desperate measures. Mississippi's burning with COVID.
This Delta surge hit, and it is just raging like wildfire through the state.
In Jackson, the state's only level 1 trauma center has 114 patients with the virus. That's quadrupled in a month. This weekend, the facility opened this 30-bed inpatient field hospital, a tent inside a parking garage.
More dire than the number of beds is the staffing.
That's right.
Dr. Luann Woodward at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, she's the alpha leader fighting the Delta variant.
That is our biggest pain point, is staffing and the morale of staff. I don't think there's a cavalry out there to come and rescue us. We've got hospitals across the state that are making public service announcements and saying things like, please do not come to our emergency room.
Across America, COVID hospitalizations have skyrocketed, up 333% in the last month.
It is real, it is terrifying, and tragically, it's preventable.
Preventable because roughly 90% of the sickest patients are unvaccinated. With so many soft targets, the Delta variant now spreads like chickenpox across our half-vaccinated country.
We didn't learn a single thing. We're right back where we started.
No more masks. Other accelerants, mask defiance.
I just don't understand why we can't be responsible for ourselves.
And schools reopening. COVID hospital patients under 18 have tripled in the last month, like this Florida 15-year-old.
Just happy that I'm not under that ventilator anymore.
Almost 100,000 more kids tested positive last week. Dallas County, Texas has nearly 700,000 kids, but 0 pediatric ICU beds for any of them who get sick.
If they have COVID and need an ICU bed, we don't have one. Your child will wait for another child to die.
Tempers and frustrations keep rising because COVID has become a viral siege. Here in Georgia, nearly 90% of ICU beds are full as COVID hospitalizations keep rising. And there's no end in sight. Nancy?
And some schools in Georgia already going virtual. Mark Strassman in Atlanta, thank you so much. We want to go now to President Biden's chief medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Fauci, good morning.
And I don't have any clips of Dr. Anthony Fauci, but as usual, if you go to the link down in the video description to CBS News Face the Nation, it goes to the CBS News Face the Nation YouTube channel, where they have the whole show split into segments you can watch for free, including the entire interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci, where, you know, he basically says that this whole fourth wave of the pandemic is frustrating because it's totally unnecessary. It's the pandemic of the unvaccinated. If, you know, so many people hadn't refused to get vaccinated who were eligible to get vaccinated, we could have probably prevented this fourth wave, and the United States is a lot luckier than other countries. And if you watch all the rest of the COVID coverage from the Sunday shows, there's like the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. One of the on the good side, and you saw it in that news summary from CBS, more people are getting vaccinated now that it's scarier that they might actually get and die from COVID. People thought it was over, and it's not over. But anyway, that's enough on COVID. I'm going to get to the next news summary. And one of the things that's funny about Fox News on a weekend like this weekend, when the Biden administration is in a lot of trouble and all of the media is like asking tough questions, how they let this, debacle of an evacuation of Afghanistan occur. What happens is all the news, the non-right-wing media, the corporate news media is much more, gives much more negative coverage to the Biden administration. So they actually look a lot more like what you see every week on Fox News, which is like negative coverage. Even, the Biden administration deserves negative coverage this week. I mentioned they're one of 4 administrations that have blame for who lost Afghanistan, if that's even the question. But anyway, a lot of the one question I have that I don't quite understand of this news summary is Fox News was the one of the corporate outlets that mentioned the earthquake in Haiti, and I'm not sure why that is. I can't give you like a real partisan reason for that. If anyone has any theories, you can let me know in the comment section as we watch Chris Wallace and Kevin Corke give the Fox News version of the first draft of history over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. We begin with breaking news on 2 fronts. In Afghanistan, President Biden boosting deployment from 3 now to 4,000 U.S. troops as Afghan government and security forces collapse under a Taliban advance. Insurgents taking control of more than 30 of the country's 34 provinces in a lightning offensive over the past 10 days. Taliban fighters now reaching the outskirts of Kabul, where the evacuation of U.S. Embassy staff has begun. And in Haiti, a powerful magnitude 7.2 quake has killed hundreds of people, with the death toll rising just as a tropical storm closes in. In a moment, we'll speak with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who oversaw the Trump administration's peace agreement with the Taliban. But first, let's bring in Kevin Corke at the White House with the latest on both Haiti and Afghanistan. Kevin.
Chris, with President Ghani set to relinquish power in Afghanistan and the Taliban now on the march in Kabul, the U.S.'s precarious presence in Afghanistan is facing the all-too-real prospect of an ignominious end, and a dangerous one as well. President Biden huddled with his senior national security advisors this weekend, mapping out an updated exit strategy from the war-torn nation. This as the Taliban has continued its march, seizing increasingly large swaths of the countryside without much resistance, finally reaching the streets of Kabul today. Afghan officials say Taliban negotiators are headed to the palace today to discuss a transfer of the city, something Biden previously said was not a foregone conclusion.
The Afghan troops have 300,000 well equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
Near the embassy in Kabul, Chinook helicopters landing to help evacuate personnel as diplomats urgently destroy sensitive documents. Afghan officials say troops have surrendered Bagram Air Base to the Taliban, which houses 5,000 inmates. Increasingly, Kabul International Airport is the only way in for U.S. troops and the only way out for anyone looking to escape. Meanwhile, half a world away, Haiti is once again in the throes of disaster, with desperate searches ongoing to find the living, trapped in rubble following a devastating 7.2 earthquake Saturday that has killed more than 300 there. Chris, that impoverished country is still trying to claw its way back from a similar powerful earthquake some 11 years ago, and is now doing so without a head of state, as its president was assassinated there last month. Chris?
Kevin Corke reporting from the White House. Kevin, thank you. And joining us now, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary.
And I will have some more criticism of Fox News when I get to Chris Wallace's interview of Mike Pompeo in a little bit. Well, that's clip number 10. Well, actually, I may have to renumber the clips because I added in the Biden clips after I numbered them. So pay no attention to those numbers, but I'll have that all correct by the time this is uploaded again as a premiere video in a couple hours. But you can check out the Mike Pompeo clip in a little bit. But like I said, this happens to be a week where the Fox News lens on the news that bad news for Biden. Well, this week there was a lot of bad news for Biden in terms of the images and the facts on the ground in Afghanistan. I mean, even if you believe in getting out of Afghanistan, like I do, and 60-70% of Americans think we should be getting out, doing it like this doesn't seem like the best way. Or anyway, that is not biased reporting this week, even though a stock clock is right twice a day, and I had someone say that's not true because digital clocks have AM and PM, but no, I was talking about the clocks with the hands. I got a comment, believe it or not, on one of my live streams when I said a stock clock is right twice a day. But I want to now get to the last two news summaries, much shorter, same information, starting with Jon Karl doing a news summary for ABC. Now, one of the permanent co-hosts of ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. How come his name and Martha Raditz's name aren't in the title of the show? Like Jake Tapper and Dana Bash are sharing a State of the Union. Doesn't seem fair to me, but you can ponder that while we watch the 2-minute plus news summary from ABC yesterday morning over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. 20 years of war, 2,312 American service members killed, and many, many more left with life-changing injuries. They fought to keep Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for the kind of terror attack that struck America on September 11, 2001. They also fought to try to make Afghanistan a stable democracy capable of defending itself. And now, before the eyes of the world, much of whatever was gained on the ground in Afghanistan has unraveled. Overnight, the Taliban seized Jalalabad, leaving Kabul as the only remaining major city not under insurgent control. And this morning, this image, eerily reminiscent of the fall of Saigon, a U.S. Chinook helicopter flying near the embassy. American diplomats have been instructed to destroy sensitive documents, electronic equipment, and even images of the American flag that could be used as propaganda. Smoke seen near the embassy roof as the evacuation gets underway. Yesterday, the president announced he's authorized additional troops, totaling 5,000, to help evacuate Americans and some of the Afghans who worked with the U.S. President Biden also said he's warned the Taliban that anything they do that puts U.S. personnel at risk will be met with a swift and strong U.S. military response. It's a mess, to be sure. But in his statement yesterday, President Biden said it's a situation he inherited from his predecessors, saying, quote, "I was the fourth president to preside over an American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I would not and will not pass this war on to a 5th." This morning, there are deep concerns about the lives at stake, the long-term security implications for the United States, and America's standing in the world. We'll take all of that to Secretary of State Tony Blinken. Martha Raddatz, who traveled to Afghanistan in June, is also standing by. But we begin this morning live in Kabul with ABC senior foreign correspondent Ian Pannell. Ian, what's the latest?
And like I said, it's pretty much the same information, a little bit shorter. I'm just going to end the quintet by letting you juxtapose those four previous news summaries with the one from CNN State of the Union, Jake Tapper. And I will talk about that news summary with you a little more after we hear Jake Tapper tell us what is the State of the Union this week. It's not going to be good. Over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is watching a tragic foreign policy disaster unfold before our eyes. Weeks before the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the deadline for President Biden's complete withdrawal of U.S. service members, the Taliban are laying waste to all the gains in that country. Having seized much of Afghanistan, the Taliban are now at the gates of the capital city of Kabul. The representatives are meeting with leadership inside the Afghan presidential palace. The rapid crumbling of the country has caught the Biden White House flat-footed. On Saturday, after pulling out almost all of the 2,500 service members there when he took office, President Biden said he would deploy more U.S. troops, 5,000 now total, for the limited mission of getting Americans and others fleeing safely out of Kabul, warning of a, quote, swift and strong U.S. response if the Taliban interfere. And with the constant thrum of helicopters overhead, sources tell CNN this morning that a total evacuation of Americans from our embassy in Kabul is well underway and should be completed by Tuesday. That is, of course, a sharp turnaround from 6 weeks ago when President Biden called it highly unlikely that the Taliban would overrun the country, an assessment that even at the time struck many experts in Biden's own administration as unrealistic. And now, as American diplomats rush to shred embassy documents and escape, it seems shocking that President Biden could have been so wrong. The U.S. has not yet been able to evacuate the 18,000 Afghan translators and their families who risked their lives to help the U.S. and are now in grave danger. And across the country, desperate Afghans already struggling with extreme poverty, and especially women and girls, are now contemplating an even more dismal life under Taliban rule. Joining us now to discuss, Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
And I'm going to show you two clips of Antony Blinken, including CNN State of the Union, in just a minute. I don't know what you think of those five news summaries. Four of them were very similar, of differing lengths of, like I said, my big criticism of the four news summaries covering Afghanistan are the lack of focus on the beginnings and, George W. Bush and Barack Obama's responsibility, more focusing on Trump and Biden's responsibility for what we're seeing now. I mean, I understand that he who is in charge when things go bad gets the blame, the buck stops here. That's why I showed those clips at the beginning, but I still think that some of that context is necessary. I hope I provided it a little better than the news summaries you saw. And now I'm going to contrast two different interview clips of Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State. He was actually on three of the programs, I think, three. But I'm not going to show you the ABC one, because instead I took this long clip of Jon Karl's interview with Liz Cheney that I'm going to heavily criticize for what I just talked about. Not really. You have Liz Cheney there, like I said, a neocon supporter of endless wars whose actual last name is Cheney, and you don't talk about the failures of the Bush-Cheney administration that are coming to fruition in Afghanistan this week. That seems like a huge failure that I will demonstrate to you when we get to that final newsmaker clip. But first, here are two Antony Blinken clips. You'll hear him say kind of the same thing to Chuck Todd in this first clip and Jake Tapper in the second clip. But I think they both have different styles that got different important answers out of Antony Blinken. The one thing he says in here, he argues this counterfactual that I think Joe Biden also talked about, claiming that if the U.S. hadn't started pulling out troops starting in May 1st, that there would have been an escalation of the war and we'd had to send 10, 20, 30,000 troops in there to restart the war. You'll see in both these clips he argues that counterfactual, and I don't think they should let, meaning that this is what would have happened if we'd done something else, which you can never really prove that unless you have like a multiverse machine or whatever. So I think people should call it out, and neither Chuck Todd nor Jake Tapper calls out that particular problem in Antony Blinken's argument, but he does a lot of explaining here, and I think Chuck Todd brings up some good questions about the timing, which I will talk about with you a little more. He actually did start off with some softball questions like, what's happening in Afghanistan? What can you tell us about the situation now? I guess that's more the Chuck Todd style. So I cut out the softball questions at the beginning and just got to the part where this isn't what you said would happen. How did you mess up this bad? Which is basically both the theme of the questioning from Chuck Todd and then Jake Tapper, starting with Chuck Todd in the clip I will talk about with you after we watch it together over here.
I want to play something you said in June about the withdrawal and get you to respond to it on the other side. Here it is.
I don't think it's going to be something that happens from a Friday to a Monday. So I wouldn't necessarily equate the departure of our forces in July, August, or by early September with some kind of immediate deterioration in the situation.
How did that assessment end up so wrong? Is that an intelligence assessment that went wrong? Is that Pentagon assessment that went wrong? Your own? How? That does not age well.
Two things, Chuck. First, we've known all along that the Taliban was at its strongest position in terms of its strength since 2001. When we came to office, that was the fact. And we said all along, including back then, that there was a real chance that the Taliban would make significant gains throughout Afghanistan. But on the other hand, I have to tell you that the inability of Afghan security forces to defend their country has played a very powerful role in what we've seen over the last few weeks. The fact is, we invested, the international community invested over 20 years, billions of dollars in these forces, 300,000 of them, with an air force, something the Taliban didn't have, with the most modern, sophisticated equipment. And unfortunately, tragically, they have not been able to defend the country, and I think that explains why this has moved as quickly as it's moved.
Let me get you to respond to what retired General Douglas Lute is quoted in the Times today. He says this: the puzzle for me is the absence of contingency planning. If everyone knew we were headed for the exits, why did we not have a plan over the past 2 years for making this work? That, we can debate staying or going, and I know that is something we're going to relitigate perhaps for a decade. But we had two presidents that were pretty insistent we were going to get out. It does look like this looks like a chaotic withdrawal for something that politically seemed inevitable to the American people. What happened there?
We've been working on this departure, this drawdown for months. We actually began an ordered departure from our embassy back at the end of April. And as facts have changed, we've adjusted to that. It's exactly why the president sent in forces that we had at our disposal to make sure that we could do this in the safest, most orderly way possible. So all of those plans have been in place. It's also true that in terms of refugees, in terms of bringing people out, the system that we inherited had been decimated. And so we've been working hard to rebuild that, as you know, and we've been doing that in real time. But Chuck, stepping back, and that's really important because I think it's vital that we put all of this in context. Here are the facts. As the president said, we went into Afghanistan 20 years ago for one mission. And that was to deal with the folks who attacked us on 9/11, to bring them to justice, and to make sure, to the best of our ability, that they would not be able to do that again from Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was brought to justice a decade ago. Al-Qaeda, the force that attacked us, has been vastly diminished. Its current capacity to attack us from Afghanistan is negligible. We have the capacity going forward to make sure that we have forces in the region and in place to deal with any reemergence of terrorism. That's why we went. We succeeded in achieving those fundamental objectives, and the idea that we would sign up for remaining there in the midst of a civil war for another 5, 10, or 20 years was simply not in the national interest. That is the hard decision the president made.
I guess the question isn't about whether 5 or 10 years. Look, there's a lot of backseat driving on this. Why do this in the summer? The fighting in Afghanistan is seasonal. Why not delay the withdrawal to the winter and give the Afghan security forces a chance when we know the Taliban retreats in the winter? Was there any, the idea that you accept this bad deal by Trump, but you'll turn back other bad deals by Trump? I mean, what was wrong with delaying 6 months?
Because we inherited a deadline negotiated by the previous administration. That deadline was May 1st. And the idea that we could have maintained the status quo beyond May 1st if the president had decided to stay, I think is a fiction. Here's what is likely to have happened had the president decided to do that. During the time from when the agreement was reached to May 1st, the Taliban had stopped attacking our forces, stopped attacking NATO forces. It had not sought to take over the country, the entire country, by going at these major provincial capitals. Come May 2nd, if the president had decided to stay, all gloves would have been off. We would have been back at war with the Taliban, attacking our forces. The offensive you've seen throughout the country almost certainly would have proceeded. We would have had about 2,500 forces in country with air power. That would not have been sufficient to deal with the situation. And I would be on your show right now explaining why we were sending tens of thousands of forces back into Afghanistan to restart a war that we need to end.
Why are you convinced that we're not going to see, in the words of, reportedly, of Secretary Austin in a report this morning, that he was making the case for staying a little bit longer, by noting what happened after we withdrew from Iraq and the rise of ISIS? Why are you...
So you can see Chuck Todd segues there without challenging Secretary of State Antony Blinken's counterfactual about what would have happened if he would have waited till what Chuck Todd suggested was, and I thought was a pretty good question. There is a fighting season in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Have I said Iraq instead of Afghanistan earlier in this video? Sorry if I have, but that's because I'm thinking back to February 2009 and George W. Bush, and that was one of George W. Bush's problem, is getting distracted by Iraq when he should have been focused on the mission in Afghanistan, as I said earlier. But Chuck Todd did talk about the fighting season in Afghanistan, but then didn't follow up on the counterfactual. And I'm going to show you and I thought Chuck Todd also did a good job finding a clip from Antony Blinken saying something that has been kind of contradicted by the facts, which Jake Tapper doesn't do. I think in the clip I'm about to show you, which is about the same length, Jake Tapper even gives Antony Blinken credit for being more honest than the clips of Biden he's about to show here. But he also is, this is not a softball liberal media, as they always, try to claim on the right, that the corporate media is liberal. It's not liberal, it's corporatist, but they do, there are actual journalists who will confront the administration when things are looking bad, and things look bad for the Biden administration. And I think Jake Tapper, like I said, he didn't even start off with softball questions. This is right at the beginning. He comes right at the Secretary of State about the debacle that has been unfolding over, let me see, is this the... Yeah, the really great clip that I was just looking at my notes really quickly. The really great clip Chuck Todd showed at the beginning was that Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, well, the fall of Afghanistan or Kabul, the government isn't going to happen from a Friday to a Monday, which is kind of exactly the way it happened. That was why I wanted to give special kudos to the Chuck Todd and his producers for at least that line of questioning. But anyway, here is the Jake Tapper version. You can decide who did the best cross-examination, comparing that last clip to the almost same length from Jake Tapper over here.
Take a listen to what President Biden was saying less than 6 weeks ago.
Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy. The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
Secretary Blinken, as you know, the Taliban has closed in on Kabul. We're evacuating the embassy, burning documents. Biden increased troops, deploying to the country twice in 3 days just to rescue those there. This is not just about the overall idea of leaving Afghanistan. This is about leaving hastily and ineptly. Secretary Blinken, how did President Biden get this so wrong?
Jake, first, let's put this in context. And as we've discussed before, we were in Afghanistan for one overriding purpose, to deal with the folks who attacked us on 9/11. That's why we went there 20 years ago. And over those 20 years, we brought bin Laden to justice. We vastly diminished the threat posed by al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to the United States, to the point where it's not capable of conducting such an attack again from Afghanistan. We're going to keep in place in the region the capacity to see if any reemergence of a terrorist threat and to be able to deal with it. And on the terms that we went into Afghanistan in the first place, we've succeeded in achieving our objectives. When the president came to office, he had a decision to make. The previous administration negotiated an agreement with the Taliban that said that our forces, our remaining forces, only about 2,500, would be out of the country on May 1st. And the idea that the status quo could have been maintained by keeping our forces there, I think is simply wrong. The fact of the matter is, had the president decided to keep forces in Afghanistan beyond May 1st, attacks would have resumed on our forces. The Taliban had not been attacking our forces or NATO during the period from which the agreement was reached to May 1st. The offensive you're seeing across the country now to take these provincial capitals would have commenced, and we would have been back at war with the Taliban. And I'd probably be on this program today explaining why we were sending tens of thousands of American forces back into Afghanistan and back to war, something the American people simply don't support. That is the reality. That's the context that we're dealing with.
You cited the May 1st deadline negotiated by the Trump administration. You did blow through that deadline. We did have troops there after May 1st. But I think, again, the issue here is not just the withdrawal of U.S. forces, it's how they were withdrawn. The rapidity, the hastiness. President Obama's former ambassador to Afghanistan, Ryan Crocker, he called the way this was done, quote, a handover to the Taliban, and, quote, we have hung them out to dry about the Afghan people. Crocker continued, quote, I'm left with some grave questions in my mind about Biden's ability to lead our nation as commander-in-chief, to have read this so wrong, or even worse, to have understood what was likely to happen and not care, unquote. Does President Biden not bear the blame for this disastrous exit from Afghanistan?
Jake, we've seen two things. First, we've known all along, we've said all along, including the president, that the Taliban was at its greatest position of strength at any time since 2001, when it was last in charge of the country. That is the Taliban that we inherited. And so we saw that they were very much capable of going on the offensive and beginning to take back the country. But at the same time, we had invested over 4 administrations billions of dollars, along with the international community, in the Afghan security and defense forces, building a modern military with the most sophisticated equipment, 300,000 forces strong, with an air force that the Taliban didn't have. And the fact of the matter is, we've seen that that force has been unable to defend the country, and that has happened more quickly than we anticipated.
Well, the idea of the force not being able to defend, I mean, what a lot of experts believe, and you can disagree with this if you want, is that having U.S. air support, having U.S. intelligence there to help the Afghan troops on the ground is what stiffens their spine, enables them to do what they do. And that's part of the larger issue about whether or not the U.S. should have left behind any sort of residual force. But beyond that is, again, the question of how poorly this was done. The idea that President Biden ordered 2,500 service members out and now is sending up to 5,000 service members back in, does that not on its face show that the exit was ineptly planned? And again, look, you told me a few months ago on this program that you thought it was entirely likely that the Taliban would be taking over the country. But President Biden, just last month, quote, The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely. He was wrong.
Jake, what we've done, what the president has done, is make sure that we were able to adjust to anything happening on the ground. And the fact that he sent additional forces in, we had those forces at the ready, fully prepared to go in the event that this moved in a direction where we needed forces in place to ensure that our personnel was safe and secure, to ensure also that we could do everything possible to bring out of Afghanistan those Afghans most at risk. That's exactly what we're doing.
Why didn't you have the troops in there and then let that happen first before taking them out?
And yeah, so I think Jake Tapper did a better job of like talking about the troop levels and how like they didn't have enough troops there for security if in the unlikely event that the Taliban overran Kabul this weekend. You also saw in the last minute of that clip that Jake Tapper did give credit to Jake Sullivan, maybe because they're both named Jake, I don't know, for not having been as wrong as Biden, but Chuck Todd, at least to his credit, and his producer's credit, they had the clip of Jake Sullivan back in June saying something that is pretty counterfactual. It's not going to be like it's going to happen from a Friday to a Monday, which is pretty much how it happened. So I don't know why Jake Tapper gave him that much credit. And then I criticized both those previous clips for not really going after Antony Blinken's counterfactual. I don't know, comparing the two, they're almost exactly the same length. I think Chuck Todd edged out Jake Tapper there, just I think because of the seasonal thing, but it's really close. They both, like I said before I showed the clips, they both sort of focused on different areas, and I think they both did pretty good cross-examinations, not perfect, but pretty good at least. Pretty good if you just want to curb your enthusiasm there, I guess. But better, I think, than the cross-examination of former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo by Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday. And I guess for those of you who I made watch Antony Blinken twice blame the deal the Trump administration made, well, Mike Pompeo was not having it. And he said some nasty things about Joe Biden being like blaming other people and pointing the finger like a schoolyard kid or something. And I didn't include that part, but I do want to show Chris Wallace doing, a pretty good job. Not as good, I think, as Jake Tapper and Chuck Todd did of cross-examining the current Secretary of State. Pretty good job of presenting to Mike Pompeo some of the talking points you heard from Antony Blinken about the bad Trump deal with the Taliban. The one thing is, Jake Tapper said in that last clip that the Afghan government and army lost morale when they started withdrawing the troops or whatever. But I've heard that I've seen some analysis that the real beginning of the loss of morale that led to this big collapse was when Mike Pompeo, back in November 2020, met with the Taliban leader. And you'll see Chris Wallace talk about that a little bit, but not as strongly as I think he should have, as I will talk about with you a little more after we watch Chris Wallace cross-examining Mike Pompeo on Fox News Sunday yesterday together over here.
But I have to say, it isn't just President Biden who says this. When we announced that you were going to be a guest on this program, a former top military commander in Afghanistan and a current top Republican member of Congress both talked about the deal that the Trump administration and you negotiated back in 2020 with the Taliban to pull out all U.S. forces. Here was President Trump when he was in office.
Basically, we're policemen right now, and we're not supposed to be policemen. We've been there for 19 years in Afghanistan. It's ridiculous.
Critics say that for the U.S. to cut a deal with the Taliban without the Afghan government even in the room was hugely demoralizing and led inevitably to where we are today.
Yeah, Chris, that's just simply not true. Go read the deal. Go read the conditions that were built into the deal. I was in the room. I was at the center of working to deliver that. The Afghans were in the room. We had the Afghans all in the room for the same time in 20 years. We had Afghan leaders, not just the corrupt leader Ghani. I mean, think about President Ghani. He spent all of his time lobbying Washington, D.C. Republicans and military leaders, the same folks you probably just talked about. If he'd have spent that time building out friends and coalitions and working with the Taliban himself, we could have gotten to reconciliation. Instead, he took money for his own good and then came to Washington to lobby for more American money, billions of dollars. He spent more time in Washington than he did talking to his own people. We negotiated a deal that formed a basis for the conditions-based withdrawal from American soldiers. I'm proud of the work that we did there. We brought a lot of young kids home. We saved a lot of American lives. We were working diligently to deliver on the president's two missions: to get our young people home, to reduce the risk to the United States from having our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines there in Afghanistan, and second, to create the conditions where we could make sure that a terror attack on the United States did not happen from there. We did it in the Philippines. We did it in Syria. We reduced terrorism risk all around the world. We would have done it in Afghanistan as well.
I just want to ask you one more question about your record, though, sir. You were the first American Secretary of State to ever meet with the Taliban, and you talked about how they had agreed to join us in the fight against terrorism. Here you are, sir.
The gentleman I met with agreed that they would break that relationship and that they would work alongside of us to destroy, deny resources to, and have al-Qaeda depart from that place.
Do you regret giving the Taliban that legitimacy? Do you regret pressing the Afghan government to release 5,000 prisoners, which they did, some of whom are now back on the battlefield fighting with the Taliban?
Chris, you make peace with your enemies. The statement that I made that day was absolutely true. You can ask the military leaders on the ground. We did good work to crush al-Qaeda. When we left office, there were fewer than 200 al-Qaeda left in Afghanistan. Chris, we never trusted the Taliban. You can ask them yourselves. We made abundantly clear if they did not live up to that piece of paper, to the words that they had put on the ground, we weren't going to allow them to just walk away from any deal that they'd struck. We were going to go crush them. We were going to go impose real costs on them. We weren't going to let them take these provincial capitals. They understood that American power was going to come to their village, to their community, to the friends and family around them, and we were going to make sure that they understood America wasn't going to allow Americans to be killed from this place. We didn't take the word of the Taliban. We watched their actions on the ground when they did the right thing and they helped us against terror. That was all good. And when they didn't, we crushed them.
Finally, and I've got about 2 minutes here, sir. You graduated first in your class from West Point in 1986, and I'm sure you vividly remember that it was just a decade earlier, in 1975, when the U.S. pulled out of Saigon, and you saw U.S. diplomats, Vietnamese, people who had been sided with us, clamoring onto helicopters on the embassy roof, which scarred our country and our military for years. What do you think the fall of Afghanistan is going to say to our allies and to our enemies? And what do you think it's going to mean for our image of ourselves?
Talk about softball questions for Mike Pompeo. That was pretty ridiculous, so that's why I had to keep playing that there, because you did see a little bit of a cross-examination. One comment I had to make about that is, geez, Mike Pompeo hates former, I guess, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, because apparently he's fled the country. But he thinks he's like totally corrupt, and I'm not surprised given what I was talking about back in February 2009 about the corruption of the Afghan government, and that was a problem all along for the entire 19 years or whatever that we were in Afghanistan. So no follow-up on that particular issue from Chris Wallace. And he did that one follow-up question about giving the Taliban legitimacy and asking the Afghan government to release prisoners and, meeting with them to give them legitimacy. But I want you to look at this photo here. Let me see if I can. I didn't change the audio on this, but here I can. Let's look at this photo here. Like, there's a link down in the video description to this Voice of America article. That's like a U.S. government outlet from November 2020 when when did I say Bush? When Trump was still in office. And it's titled Pompeo Meets with Afghan Taliban Negotiators in Qatar. And so here's that photo from that article. And so there's Pompeo on the left wearing a mask. And then the person closest to him there, you know who that dude is? That is... here, let me look at my... That dude is Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who's basically now the leader of Afghanistan. And he was released from, I think in February 2020, he was released from jail in Pakistan at the request of the Trump administration. And so that is a really important fact that Chris Wallace never asked Mike Pompeo about. He did ask about meeting with the Taliban, and like I said earlier, I have heard that those meetings with the Taliban from the U.S. government praising them as terrorism fighters, etc. That was I've seen some analysts say that started one of the a huge drop in morale. That's when a regional the villages started selling out to the Taliban, and most of the Afghan military lost the will to fight, and everything was back when Trump made that deal and Mike Pompeo had that meeting, and that may be why he made his way to the Sunday show to try to protect his reputation so he can run for president, apparently, and I don't know, maybe in 2024, who knows. But I think Chris Wallace did not talk about how the Trump administration actually got the current leader of the Taliban, who now is the leader of Afghanistan, released from prison in Pakistan, and Mike Pompeo personally met with him and said what a great guy he was in November 2020. I mean, didn't literally say great guy, but did praise him as part of the negotiations. So I just wanted to put that in there. This next clip is from CBS News Face the Nation. It's Nancy Cordes talking to one of the top Republicans in the House of Representatives, Steve Scalise. I think he's the Republican whip. What does that make him, number 3? Can't remember for sure. But anyway, my one criticism of the Face the Nation coverage is they were just so focused on COVID that, this clip ends. It's less than 3 minutes, and it's a useful clip because it shows how members of Congress are being briefed by the White House. I think this is going to make things more difficult in terms of bipartisanship. Not that Biden, after this one infrastructure deal, had much hope of bipartisanship anymore anyway, but he's getting a lot of criticism from Republicans. And Nancy Cordes, she does ask Steve Scalise about the inevitability, but not much about even Trump's responsibility, or certainly not the long-term Republican neocon forever war in the Middle East mindset that had got us to this point to begin with. But anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after we watch 3 minutes of Steve Scalise on CBS News' Face the Nation in the penultimate newsmaker clip today over here.
You and your House colleagues just received a briefing from the Secretaries of State and Defense. What did they tell you? And are you confident that all U.S. diplomats are going to be able to get out of Afghanistan safely?
Well, during the call, you actually had events still continuing to unfold. And so in real time, we were seeing things on social media that they weren't really talking about on the call. But it's a very dire situation when you see the United States Embassy being evacuated. In fact, you just had President Biden a few days ago saying you wouldn't see helicopters evacuating the embassy like Saigon, and yet here we are. This is President Biden's Saigon moment, and unfortunately, it was very predictable. It seems like many in President Biden's intelligence community got this devastatingly wrong, and I think a lot of questions will be asked later about why just weeks ago they were saying something completely different than what we're seeing on the ground today in Afghanistan.
Right. Last week, the president said he did not expect that the Taliban would be able to retake all of the country. But here's what he's saying now. He said this weekend, 1 more year or 5 more years of U.S. military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country. White House officials are essentially arguing it was President Trump who set this in motion when he agreed to withdraw U.S. troops completely by May 1st. So was all of this inevitable?
No, and in fact, you're seeing a lot of finger pointing and blaming. There used to be a saying that the buck stops here on the president's desk and he wants to blame everybody else. But look, President Trump had an agreement in place that was conditions-based, and those conditions were not met. In fact, many of the conditions included that the Taliban wouldn't overtake the cities that they have now overtaken under President Biden's leadership. So President Biden didn't follow through on the conditions that were in place. He just let them come and run roughshod. And they're destroying, documents, burning documents at the embassy and trying to get everybody out they can instead of following through on the commitments that were made. And this sends a more concerning message to our allies around the world, really sends a concerning message to our enemies around the world who are watching this. China's very involved in what's happening right now in Afghanistan, as are other adversaries. And so they're seeing just how easy it was to overtake these areas where the president really said it wouldn't happen, and it did happen. So it's an epic failure on President Biden's foreign policy. He needs to take ownership of it and take other steps to make sure this doesn't happen again. If he's not going to clean house, he was either widely misled by his own intelligence or he was misleading the American people deliberately. But he said very different things just days ago than what we're seeing happen on the ground. He's got to take ownership of that.
Congressman, I want to switch gears and turn to the very serious COVID situation in your state.
In Louisiana, there is a serious COVID situation, and that's what the COVID broadcasting system, CBS, focused on, as I said before I showed that clip. And there was some light, generic questioning from Nancy Cordes about, the Trump deadline made this inevitable, right? But not really deep. And did you see there how Steve Scalise fit in? There are actually a lot of China, Russia, Pakistan, all involved in what's going on with the Taliban, but he slips in the China there because we're kind of coming full circle on who lost Afghanistan with who lost China, because that's one of the major political points that they're hoping to use against Biden again, soft on China, that goes all the way back to 1949, I guess. But the one thing I wanted to point out about that and about the previous clip of Mike Pompeo, Nancy Cordes obviously didn't follow up, but Chris Wallace didn't follow up either on the other counterfactual that Republicans are getting away with. I criticize Antony Blinken for saying, well, if we hadn't started pulling out now, we would be, having this big war and we'd be increasing troops, and people would say, why are you continuing the war? Well, Donald Trump himself and a lot of Republicans, as you just saw both Mike Pompeo and Steve Scalise say, well, if Trump was still there, everything would be so much better, which I find that hard to believe. It was conditions-based, and somehow I don't think that Donald Trump would have managed this better than Joe Biden. I'm not saying it would have been worse, but maybe inevitable, like the word Nancy Cordes used, maybe that is the best word, but anyway, I do have one more newsmaker clip that I promised to show you, and this is the entire interview by ABC's Jon Karl of Representative Liz Cheney from Wyoming, and I have this set so that I can stop it partway through and start talking again, as I've done a couple times in the past, because the thing I kept waiting, I criticized all the corporate media coverage from yesterday by saying that they talked about, Biden's responsibility for what's happening, and then was Trump more responsible or Biden more responsible? But they didn't really talk about Obama and George W. Bush, even though in some ways they're even more responsible, especially George W. Bush. And so they have on Representative Liz Cheney. Her last name is Cheney. She's a neocon who believes in the forever wars. And Jon Karl lets her get away with just talking about Biden's responsibility and Trump's responsibility. And there are like a couple points where I'm watching, and it's like so close. Oh, he's going to ask Liz Cheney about Bush Cheney, and they're beginning this forever war and botching it. But no, never really happens. But let's watch the beginning of that clip, and I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together, part of it together over here.
Congresswoman Liz Cheney, a member of the Armed Services Committee and a former State Department official. Congresswoman Cheney, when you look at this effort, nearly 20 years of a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, $83 billion spent to train and equip the Afghan security forces. Why has this been such a colossal failure?
Well, I think if you look at where we were, if you look at what it would have taken in terms of maintaining the status quo, 2,500 to 3,500 forces on the ground, conducting counterterrorism, counterintelligence operations, this disaster, the catastrophe that we're watching unfold right now across Afghanistan did not have to happen. And it's not just that people predicted that this would happen. Everyone was warned that this would happen. We've now created a situation where, as we get to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we are surrendering Afghanistan to the terrorist organization that housed al-Qaeda when they plotted and planned the attacks against us. It's inexcusable, it's devastating, and it is going to have ramifications not just for Afghanistan, not just for us in Afghanistan, not just for the war on terror, but globally for America's role in the world, the extent to which America's adversaries know they can threaten us, and our allies are questioning this morning whether they can count on us for anything.
Now, ultimately, this is President Biden's decision. He is the one that has called for this withdrawal, is going forward with it. But this didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, It was President Trump that negotiated the agreement with the Taliban to have a complete withdrawal that was supposed to actually happen by May 1st. So who bears responsibility?
Look, I think...
So there you see, he's asked first about Biden's responsibility. Now he's asking about Trump's responsibility. Both those questions are fair, but not the only question that should be asked of Liz Cheney. And I'll get back to her answer, and we'll see after this question, does he ask about the Bush-Cheney responsibility of Liz Cheney? But we'll talk about that a little more after we watch a little more of her answer over here.
Absolutely, President Biden bears responsibility for making this decision, but there is no question that President Trump, his administration, Secretary Pompeo, they also bear very significant responsibility for this. They walked down this path of legitimizing the Taliban, of perpetuating this fantasy, telling the American people that the Taliban were a partner for peace. President Trump told us that the Taliban was going to fight terror. Secretary Pompeo told us that the Taliban was going to renounce al-Qaeda. None of that has happened. None of it has happened. Today, as we watch the Taliban, for example, release prisoners across Afghanistan, there's very real concern that there are not just fighters in those prisons who will join the battle in Afghanistan, but that terrorist groups globally will, in fact, be fed new soldiers in their war on terror from those prisons. It's a devastating set of circumstances, but the delegitimization of the Afghan government, the notion in the Trump administration, the suggestion that at one point they were saying we're going to invite the Taliban to Camp David.
On September 11th.
Yeah. I mean, this disaster certainly began. And look, the notion of we're going to end endless wars, that campaign slogan, what we're watching right now in Afghanistan is what happens when America withdraws from the world. So everybody who has been saying America needs to withdraw, America needs to retreat, we are getting a devastating, catastrophic, real-time lesson in what that means.
Well, let me ask you about something your former colleague Justin Amash said. He said the Taliban's rapid gains in Afghanistan underscored the futility of permanent occupation. The United States wasn't able to meaningfully shape circumstances through 20 years of war. We'd have seen the same results had we pulled out 15 years ago or 15 years from now. End the wars. That is something you hear, you hear from Republicans and Democrats.
This is not ending the war.
Oh, so close, so close. Did you see that 15 years ago? Who was in office 15 years ago? Counting back. No mention of Bush Cheney or any of the mistakes of Bush Cheney talking to Liz Cheney. Just, that was the closest. I thought, 15 years ago, he's finally getting... No, didn't ask. Anyway, back to Liz Cheney's answer.
What this is doing actually is perpetuating it. What we have done and what we're seeing in Afghanistan is instead of keeping 2,500 forces on the ground, which with air power, working with the Afghans, we were able to keep the Taliban at bay. We were able to prevent the Taliban from establishing safe havens with 2,500 to 3,500 troops on the ground. What we're seeing now is actually the opposite of ending war. What we're seeing now is a policy that will ensure that we will, in fact, have to have our children and our grandchildren continuing to fight this war at much higher cost. So everybody, the Rand Paul, Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, Joe Biden view of the world here is fundamentally dangerous and irresponsible and wrong.
But quickly, let me ask you, as you know, poll after poll for the last several years have shown that most Americans wanted us out of Afghanistan. So can you really maintain for the long term a military operation that most of the American people do not support?
Look, as leaders, we have an obligation, no matter what the issue is, to tell the American people the truth. And we have an obligation to explain what's necessary. There's one question that matters when it comes to Afghanistan or any other deployment of U.S. forces. And that question is, what does American security require? And if American security requires that our enemies can't establish safe havens to attack us again, then our leaders across both parties have the responsibility to explain to the American people why we need to keep a deployment of forces on the ground. This has been an epic failure across the board, one we're going to pay for years to come.
All right, Congresswoman Liz Cheney, thank you very much.
Coming up.
Oh, that's gotta hurt. That definitely is painful watching Jonathan Karl let the daughter of Dick Cheney get away with saying, leaders have to tell us the truth. Oh, yeah, that's what the Cheney name stands for. But no questioning about anything Dick Cheney stood for in the beginning of the endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or the loss of focus from Afghanistan to Iraq that didn't attack us on 9/11, and failure at Tora Bora that could have been the end of the war, and then the promotion of corrupt governments that continued through the Obama, Trump, and now the beginning of the Biden administrations, I guess. But now those corrupt Afghan governments are gone, and we have the Taliban back. And as to who lost Afghanistan, well, I think I've showed you enough clips to give you a lot of reference on all four of the presidents who share that blame. And anyway, I appreciate those of you who joined me for this live stream, because it looks like the first 3 minutes of this did not end up in the live stream. I'm going to keep this as an unlisted video and then upload the recorded show as a premiere video in maybe an hour or two. We'll see how long it takes to upload, and I apologize for that. I don't know why that happened. But anyway, I will end the show with a Dash and Sandy or Dandy clip. My dog Sandy and my cat Dash live together pretty well. You'll see them interacting at the food bowl again. And this is after the dog Sandy finished eating. I thought I was going to get them to interact, but they're I don't know what the deal is. They're I don't know. Maybe it's just I have to relate this to my life experience, so I see this as two guys standing at a urinal. They're looking at each other like two guys standing at a urinal. I don't know. You can let me know what you think after you watch the Dash and Sandy or Dandy clip together over here. Okay, I didn't mean to suggest that guys at urinals nuzzle each other in the ear, but what I meant is they were both trying to pretend that the other one wasn't there and didn't exist, although Sandy did sort of sniff at Dash there a little bit. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the Dash and Sandy or Dandy clip to end the show. This is the longest Monday Media Mix-Up I've ever done. I'm at an hour and 40 minutes, but I guess there was a lot of clips to cover this week. I will be back next Monday, and for the live viewers who made it this far, I will be back in an hour or two to monitor the re-upload of the recorded version of this show. So if you are around for that, I hope to see you there. And until then, and then until next Monday, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.